Today I'm going to be taking a look at some paintings I saw at the Metropolitan Museum of Art recently. And we're going to be studying brushstrokes and how to make them more effective in your painting. I have kids and grandkids that live in Manhattan, not far from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the Metropolitan is one of the best, if not the best, art museums in the world. So it's a great place to go if you ever get a chance. Or whatever museum you happen to live near, or some good galleries. It's really helpful to study paintings in person, where you're seeing real brushstrokes, real color, understanding maybe how an artist simplifies shapes and color and values. A lot better than books or the internet. Of course, those are really helpful and I use them a lot, but nothing like seeing a painting in person. So I was at the Metropolitan about a month ago, and you're able to take photographs there. So I got some large files. And I thought we'd take a look at paintings and think about brushstrokes of these artists. And we'll start here with Claude Monet. They have a lot of good Monets there. But there's kind of 5 things I think about. I mean, there's tons more than 5, but these kind of help me as far as brushstrokes go. The first one is planning. If I can plan out my painting in the beginning, simplify the subject into 4 to 8 big shapes, 2 to 3 values in each of those shapes, then the brushstrokes become a lot easier. But if not, if you're seeing tons of detail and way too many shapes and values, you're going to have a hard time with brushstrokes. Number 2 is values. The most important thing about brushstrokes is how dark or light they are. What value are they compared to other brushstrokes? That's the most important thing. You can have a real nice, expressive brushstroke, but if it's the wrong value, it's not going to work. Number 3 is suggest form and not render detail. So I'm going to use the brushstrokes to show the form, not outline and see as much detail as I can get. Use your brushstrokes to suggest form instead of detail. And number 4 is use as few brushstrokes as possible to suggest that form. So if I can suggest something in 2 to 3 brushstrokes as opposed to 7 or 8, it's going to read a lot better. And number 5, use thin paint, thin brushstrokes in the shadows, and thick brushstrokes in the lights. So those are the 5 things we're going to kind of look at brushstroke wise. And we're looking at Monet here, a French impressionist who, of course, they use tiny brushstrokes. They use small strokes, not so much in this one, but small strokes of more pure color next to each other. It kind of creates a vibration and an atmosphere and sense of light. But you can see the tiny strokes in the trees here. But when they use small strokes, it didn't destroy the form. So you can see a lot of small strokes in the dark green trees, but the form in those trees holds together. And usually when we use tiny brushstrokes, we kind of lose the big form. So if you're going to use small brushstrokes, and there's a lot of painters in here, or several that did, make sure you don't lose the feeling of the big shapes, because that's what holds your painting together. But he's using here, if we zoom in at the figures, using big brush strokes, as few as possible to suggest these figures. He's also not rendering any detail. There's faces, but there's no features or fingers, no small little dark accents, light highlights everywhere. It's big shapes, more silhouettes of light against dark or dark against light to suggest the form. That's something I think these older artists did better than we do now, because they didn't learn from photographs like we tend to do. They had to rely on painting from life. And when you do that, you don't see things in terms of detail and sharp edges. You see things in terms of big shapes and edges blending or blurring to create depth or atmosphere. And you see mass instead of detail. Photographs are more detail oriented. And when we spend too much time painting from those, or maybe learning from those first, and nothing wrong with details, but it is harder, I think, to understand what these guys saw when they worked from life as opposed to just working from details. So if you work from details, that's great, but try painting from life sometimes too. That'll help you see, and it'll help your brushwork a lot. And we think of this loose, big, simple suggestion or impression as impressionists, but artists were doing that for a long time. Now, this is a painting by Thomas Worthington Witheridge. He was an American tonalist in the Hudson River School time, maybe somewhat close to the time of Monet, but not impressionistic. He's not doing small strokes of pure color to kind of the eye blend together. He's doing bigger shapes of using browns and blacks and light and dark. But he also simplified his brushstrokes using big, thick, simple brushstrokes to suggest detail as well. And if we zoom in on this painting, you can see his figures are real similar to Monet's figures in the painting we were just looking at. He's using big, thick, light brushstrokes, maybe 4, 5 brushstrokes there to suggest that figure of a woman in a white dress with a white hat and her hand on her hip. And it just reads real well, but there's no detail there. Same thing with the detail in the Monet. It's the same approach here of just seeing the big silhouetted shapes, the dark and the light brushstrokes that just simplify and show the form a lot better. And I think he did that really well. Same type of approach to the brushstroke. But you can see the brushstrokes are more smoothed out, good simple values, but smoothed out as opposed to choppy, smaller brushstrokes that Monet had here. Nice atmospheric look back in here by chopping in the blue and the yellow green and the darker green, blue violet, kind of next to each other, and they create kind of a more of a vibration that gives the look the Impressionists achieved so well. Here's another Monet, maybe a bit before the height of Impressionism. Bigger shapes, not so much pure color, a little more of the tonalist brushwork that you learned from kind of the Barbizon school there in France, which is pretty much tonalism and not the pure color, smaller strokes to break things up. But still, nice brush strokes that describe the form. Big, thick, light areas, thinner, dark areas. Now this is a Pissarro. We'll zoom in a bit. And here he's using short, choppy strokes, not outlining everything with outline and detail. It's silhouetted shape, like the carriage here with the figure and the 2 horses. If we zoom in a little bit, it's a silhouette rather than outline with a bunch of detail. And the horses just dissolve into the street. And it may not read that well close up, but in relation to everything else, it fits in. It looks atmospheric, like it's in time and space rather than a flat, posterized view of the horse and carriage. Same thing with the trees. They just blend into the brushstrokes, blend into the atmosphere, into the background. Not relying on outline and detail, even though there's small, short, choppy brushstrokes for the trees, those trees still hold together as a big mass against the lighter building. Another artist would have handled it differently, keeping it more solid mass, maybe, with a little bit of, holes of the building showing through. Not a great job there, but get the idea. This is another Monet. And you can see the short, choppy brush strokes of color next to each other, especially in the trees, the yellow greens, the yellow, the blue green. Now they all work together to kind of suggest the form and the light. Very, very impressionistic. Same thing with the tree. It's not a solid tree blocked in first with a solid 1 or 2 values, more choppy to suggest the form kind of turning into the sky as opposed to a sharp outline And the Impressionists used that real well. Now, not so Vermeer. This is Vermeer that is there. A little more outlined, flat, filling in the values of the skirt here. And not so much the dissolving of the form into the background, although some of his paintings, it did do that really well. Again, bigger, simpler brushstrokes to show the form. Edges are somewhat hard, but the brushstrokes are more shape-oriented than detail-oriented. Now, it does have a lot of detail in some areas in here, but using the brushstrokes to show the form, 2 to 3 values to start off with, then maybe another light highlight and a dark accent, but simplifying the values and simplifying the shapes. And you can, when you see the paint, and you don't see it in the photograph here, but build up on these light areas quite a bit. The lights here are a lot thicker, and the darks and the dress and the tablecloth a lot thinner. If we zoom in here, really nice job of just simplifying the form with simple values. It's really not tight and overly detailed. He did a good job of just keeping things simple, just enough to show the form. There is some smaller dark and light highlights in there to give a bit more sharpness to the image, but not overly detailed. Now we look at this. This is Giovanni Tiepolo. And this looks like a small painting because the frame is so thin. But this is about 20 feet high. I'm looking up at it, and I can touch the bottom of the frame. Can't reach up very high. Very big, huge painting. But I really liked his work. We look, I took a photograph a little closer. This is at the bottom of the painting. This is a helmet on a piece of cloth on the ground. And you see the brushwork, the real thick lights there. You work from dark to light, building up maybe the big overall value with somewhat thinner paint, not worrying about the brushstrokes, scrubbing in the overall value, then getting a little darker. And then the lights are thicker, and you want to follow the form more with the lights. Real nice brushstrokes in here, kind of following the direction of the form, and good use of values there. Nice, the lion on top of the helmet. Very much simplified, so that the brushstrokes are more simple and it reads so much better. But his painting's very interesting to look at. This is another painting, a bit smaller, a lot smaller. But he did use outline here. He used a lot of outline in these figures to kind of accent the figures, almost make them a bit graphic. The coloring is, there's not a lot of reflected light. There's basic local color, dark and light blue on the cloth here, on Mary. Same thing here, dark and light yellow. But very expressive brushstrokes, using the darks and the lights very simply, not a lot of detail involved. And where there is detail, it works really well. It's not overly done. Nice brushstroke on the figures here to show the form and the light. So another one of his, again, very loose brushstroke. It's not tight or overly picky. There is detail, not to say detail is bad, but it's handled very loosely, and the values are more important, and the big shapes are more important. Just enough smaller darks in there to suggest the form. But there's a real looseness to his figures, I think, because of his brushwork. Now, this is Child Hassam. He was an American Impressionist, and he studied with Monet. So you can see the short, choppy brushstrokes in here. And you can see the bare toned canvas underneath coming through in a lot of areas, especially on the building and some on the shadow in the street. Darks are a lot thinner, but a lot of pure color next to each other. Kind of creates that vibration of just stuff going on without overly rendering or adding a lot of detail. There is short, little, small brush strokes, but it's not rendering detail. The big shapes of the shadow of all these things in the street, the blue carriages and so on in the street, hold together as a shape. They don't fall apart as just tons of little detail. And that's the key if you're going to use small, short, choppy brush strokes. Make sure that they don't break up the big shapes to where they don't hold together. And here's a close-up. You can see the wagon here, the bus, or whatever that is. Again, small little strokes. And that's hard to do without losing your form. But he doesn't lose the form here. It really holds together well. And the brush strokes are really expressive. And he's painting, don't know that he didn't use photographs here, because photographs were around by then, but my guess is not. He at least learned to paint from life instead of photographs. There's a Willard Metcalf. He also studied with Monet, and you can see some short, choppy brush strokes. But again, the big shapes hold together in there. They don't fall apart because of the small strokes. But big, simple areas, more just scrubbing to fill in the dark area. Light brush strokes are a bit more expressive, following the direction of the grass. This one's very nice. A lot of muted color that allows some of the less muted, stronger color to really stand out. And we think of brush strokes, simple brush strokes, as something that came about with the Impressionists, but this is a Richard Parkes Bonington. Very loose, very simple brush strokes, just to show the form. A lot of thick lights in the trees. Darks are a lot thinner. He's not using as few brush strokes as possible to suggest the lights in the trees, but he is everywhere else. All these shapes down in here and in the background are very, very simple. You don't need to render everything to the utmost with as much detail as possible. So learn to use bigger, simpler brush strokes with thicker paint in the lights, a little thinner in the darks. Goes a long way to show depth and helps your scene read a lot better. Now this is Henry Ossawa Tanner. This is the Holy Family in Bethlehem. The shapes are big, simple, not a lot of detail anywhere, but using dark and light and thick and thin brush strokes to show the form without adding a lot of detail. But in person, you can really see how the thick and the thin paint works. It's almost a palette knife stroke right here. Probably is with some other palette knife strokes. On top of some thinner paint. So blocking those, scrubbing those darks in and coming back and establishing the lights. Again, the more simple, the better. Too many brush strokes to suggest the light just wouldn't work. But keep it more simple. Some glazing also of some color over those thicker brush strokes adds a lot to the coloring. Then there's Sargent, who's using kind of every brush stroke's kind of a finished brush stroke is what it looks like. Keeping the darks thinner, the lights thicker. The lights, again, using as few brush strokes as possible to suggest the leaves on these palm trees. Fewer is always better when it comes to brush strokes, and going thicker in the lights, thinner in the darks. You do paint some darks on top of lights where the darks are small, because you don't want to have to paint around small little darks. So for the small brush strokes, just put them on top of the light, the small darks. But generally, you want to paint dark and then to light. So blocking in all these darks first in kind of big, simple shadow patterns, and then laying in the lights a lot thicker. But the more you think in terms of each brush stroke, a finished brush stroke, the looser your painting's going to be. It's hard to do. And when you do make a mistake, don't try and paint over the mistake with thicker paint. It's better to scrape the area and then go back and repaint it. Matter of fact, it's helpful sometimes to get your painting blocked in with thicker paint and then scrape the whole thing. Once you realize your values are good, your shapes are big and simple, scrape it so that you have a little more texture on the canvas. You can even let it dry and then go back and repaint it. It's just so much easier to repaint because your shapes are there, your values are there, your colors are there. Then you can focus on brushwork because everything is already set up and you don't have to think much about what color or what value because it's already there. And you can just load up the brush, follow the form. Sargent could do that without thinking. So unlike the rest of us, we have to think a bit more. There's another Sargent. Again, they'll build up on these lights and using the brush strokes to just follow the form. You can see how thick some of this paint is on the arm up on top and the arm down below, and then the thinner darks. Not much going on in the background, doesn't need much going on. It's a lot thinner and the lights are built up a lot thicker. But fewer brush strokes to suggest the coat. You could really do a lot more brush strokes, but it just wouldn't have the same feel. So use as few brush strokes as possible to suggest the form. There's another sergeant, just zooming in a little bit. You can see the thick paint on the lights. And there is some detail, but not much. It doesn't have so much detail that you lose the form. But setting up everything with the darker values a lot thinner, and then laying in these light strokes really thin. And he just had the ability to put something down once and make it the right value and color. For most of us, have to put something down, look at it, and decide how we need to adjust it to make it work better. But I think that's what learning is, that when you do put a brush stroke down the wrong value or color, you know how to fix it, where in the beginning you don't. It just becomes frustrating. But it's another one of the sergeant. Oh, it's the same, might be the same painting. But again, how thick that paint is. And is using brush strokes not to be too literal, but just suggest the form. And learning to suggest instead of being literal with simple brush strokes is really hard. This is a good example of that. Another sergeant, one of his portraits, using as few brush strokes as possible to suggest the hand. He's got an overall value here on the hand, red and yellow with probably a little bit of black. Probably 3 values, a light, a halftone, and a shadow, and then just rendering the shape, starting with probably just the big silhouetted shape, and then adding these darks and highlights on top of the halftone. The more simple you can start it, the better. And I think this goes without saying then to say that when you draw your subject first, usually drawing with either a piece of charcoal or really thin transparent paint just to get a drawing down there. Your drawing should be as simple as possible, because paintings only get tighter the more you work on it. And if you start it very loose, you can gradually build up and decide where you want the most detail. But if you start off with a very detailed drawing, you're going to end up with even a more detailed painting. So start simple and then end up more complicated. This one too, you can see the buildup of the lights on the hat and the shirt there. Really nice painting. This was very thin here. So is this. Some of this background was just toned canvas. So keeping those darks very thin and having those lights follow the form. They're not just randomly put in there. They really follow the form of the shoulder and the arm, and that makes a big difference. Don't need to follow the form in the shadows usually. You can put your brush strokes on any way you want. Variety, maybe some variety of direction is probably best, but in the lights you want to follow the form. You can see that here in this Robert Henry. These lights and halftones are suggesting the form a lot better. But knowing where the values and big shapes are, planning them out first, makes it easier for your brush strokes to describe the form. You get all these lights in here and in the face and the hat, very thick. And those are the last things to go on, obviously. You might put them in early on just to see where they go and how they look, but I would scrape them and build up the halftones and shadows and then come back and put them back in. But scraping your painting after it's filled in, if the values and shapes work well, I think is a good way to focus on brushwork. And this is a early 1700 painting from Fragonard, and you can see how loose it is. Impressionists had nothing on him for loose brushwork. Again, all the shapes have 2 to 3 values, thick lights and thin darks. Very expressive brushwork. And you can use more expressive brushwork the more you've planned out where your values and shapes are. And this is a Cecilia Beaux, American Impressionist painter, turn of the century. Again, big simple shapes, halftones, lights and darks in the white. The lights getting thicker, following the form. Nice just suggestion of the hand here and here without doing too much detail there. Picking 3 values, getting a big silhouetted shape, and just laying that in. If you can simplify your values to 3, your brushstrokes can be much more simple. This is a Mary Cassatt, a quick portrait of a girl and a dog. Very nice brushstrokes, very quick. You can almost say it's unfinished, but it definitely, she said all she wants to say with this. And the brushstrokes are great, maybe a bit more expressive than some of the others, to where they don't finish off an area, but that's kind of a vignetted. Further out you go from the face of the dog and the girl, the more simple those brushstrokes are. And that just helps to make the faces stand out more. You don't have to finish everything from side to side and top to bottom. Pick 2 or 3 areas where you're going to finish and let everything else kind of go. And that allows you to get more expressive with brushstrokes. This is a Hilda Belcher. She was a student of Robert Henry, one of the ashcan painters. And zooming in a bit more, like on the hands here. Again, about 3 to 4 values set up the hand with a big, simple silhouetted shape. You got your dark, your light, and then kind of a middle value in there with some dark accents. More simple brushstrokes there really suggest the hand a lot better. Same thing with the face. Nice job of showing the form with the brushstrokes following the form there. And not a lot of detail. There's value change from the light cheekbone and the light side plane of the nose. And then the cheek here is just real rounded. They had several John Constables, I would guess outdoor studies, thinking about composition and suggesting the light, but the brushstrokes are really expressive. You can see how thicker lights, darker shadows, following the direction of the form, using as few brushstrokes as possible. Really very, very expressive. And he did studies for he did a lot of 6-foot paintings. And he would do a 6-foot study before doing the 6-foot finished painting. And those are really interesting because the brushstrokes are a lot looser, a lot more build up in the lights. This is a Sir Thomas Lawrence, British painter. Not loose by any means, but there's some areas in the paintings that are just really nicely done with simplified brushstrokes. You know, the hand here has the darks, lights, and kind of halftone with some dark accents. Very Sargent-like looking right in here. Same thing with the brushstrokes on the fur and on the silk coat there. That thickness of light and thinner darks really goes a long way to add some depth to that, or form to the coat, and nice edges on the fur here. Now I've got a few here just to talk about brushstroke wise. In my paintings, this is done outside. I really want to separate the dark and the light, especially on this strong of a sunlit day. And if I can do that, it makes it easier to decide what type of brushstroke. Shadows here, I'm doing short, choppy brushstrokes of a variety of color, trying to keep the values somewhat close. And then bigger, simpler strokes in the sunlight, a little variety in the trees. But most of the variety is in the foreground shadow. And keeping the darks thin. Even though the darks are fairly thick, they're not as thick as the lights. Another one, this is Turnip Creek in northern Georgia. Again, short, choppy strokes with some color variation in the grass to suggest the light, kind of that vibration of different colors. And then the warm against the cool, bigger, simpler strokes in the shadow and building up the lights. But I can go any direction in the shadow. Generally, of the trees, I go vertical to suggest the vertical shape of the tree. But I can go any direction in the shadows, unless the shadows are real light, like in there. But I want to really follow the form in the light areas with these brush strokes. That helps show the form. And the thicker I can get the lights, the better. These are some elm trees in Tennessee, cloudy day, and trying to push and pull the edges of these brush strokes to get the reflection to kind of read differently than the real tree trunks and shrubbery. Otherwise, it looks like a mirrored image as opposed to reflection in water. And building up the lights and not hesitating just to drag a brush through all the color variation in the brush strokes, just to lose some of the edges and still getting a little thinner in the darks and thicker in the lights. Last one here. This is in Houston, Georgia. And more random brush strokes in the shadow here, just to create some interest. I start with maybe a flat value about that dark, and then scrub in some lighter shadows, just to vary the brushwork in the shadows and in the barn. The shadows are big, and the bigger the shadows, the lighter they get. So you see more into the grass in the barn than inside the barn. That's real thin there, almost just a kind of a stain of blue and burnt sienna and building up the lights. This is mostly just toned burnt sienna with a little bit of greens and violets scrubbed in to suggest trees without overdoing it. Then the negative shapes or spaces of the sky holes in there give that tree some form without being too detailed.